The freezing wind sliced through Grace O'Connor's thin coat as she clung desperately to the exterior railing of the thundering locomotive, her knuckles white with effort, her heart pounding against her ribs like a wild animal seeking escape. She had known boarding without a ticket was risky criminal even, but desperation had a way of making impossible choices seem necessary. Found yourself a stowaway, boys. The conductor's voice cut through the train's rumble as two burly men in railway uniforms seized her arms, dragging her toward the open door of the moving car. Grace struggled against their grip, her pleas lost to the howling prairie wind and the indifferent churning of iron wheels on steel tracks. "Please, I'm just trying to reach my uncle in Flagstaff. I can work for passage." She tried to reason with them, but the men's faces remained unmoved, hardened by years of dealing with those who thought railway rules didn't apply to them. "Rules are rules, miss," the older conductor said flatly. "Next time, buy a ticket or stay where you belong." With brutal efficiency, they hoisted her struggling form between them. Grace's scream tore from her throat as they hurled her from the moving train into the endless expanse of Arizona Territory, 1885. For one terrible moment, she was suspended in nothingness, the ground rushing up to meet her. Instead of the bone-crushing impact she expected, Grace collided with something solid yet yielding. Strong arms enveloped her, and she and her unexpected savior tumbled together through the scrubby brush beside the tracks. When the world stopped spinning, she found herself sprawled atop a broad-chested man in a worn leather vest and dusty cowboy hat. Keen blue eyes studied her from beneath the brim as he kept his arms protectively around her. A faint smile played at the corners of his mouth as the train thundered away into the distance. "Seems to me," he drawled in a voice as warm and rough as sun-baked leather, "the railroad ain't too keen on your company." He sat up, still supporting her. "Name's Daniel Lockhart, and I reckon if they don't want you on that train, you might as well ride with me." Grace stared at the handsome stranger who had just saved her life, the dust from their fall settling around them like a veil, the vast western landscape stretching endlessly in every direction. She had nowhere to go, no money, and no ticket, but she had just found something unexpected. A chance. "Grace O'Connor," she managed, her voice trembling but determined. "And I suppose I don't have much choice, do I, Mr. Lockhart?" His smile widened, revealing a dimple in his left cheek. "Everyone's got choices, Miss O'Connor, but some are just a damn sight better than others." Daniel helped Grace to her feet, steadying her when her knees threatened to buckle. The reality of what had just happened hit her like a physical blow. She could have died. Would have died if not for this stranger's intervention. The train was already a distant black shape on the horizon, carrying away her hopes of reaching Flagstaff and finding her last living relative. "Are you hurt?" Daniel asked, his hands gentle as he examined a scrape on her arm. "Nothing serious," Grace said, brushing dust from her simple blue traveling dress. "Though my pride might take longer to recover." Daniel chuckled, a warm sound that somehow made the vast emptiness around them feel less threatening. "Pride heals slower than bones, that's for certain." He glanced toward his horse, a magnificent chestnut stallion grazing nearby. "May I ask what was so important that you risked stealing passage on that train?" Grace hesitated. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford to give freely, not after everything she'd been through. Yet this man had just saved her life. She owed him something of the truth. "My parents died of fever in Chicago 3 months ago," she said, her voice steady despite the grief that still felt raw. "My uncle in Flagstaff is my only remaining family. I used the last of my money for a train ticket to Phoenix, but it was stolen at the station." She lifted her chin. "I couldn't just stay there with nothing, so I, made a decision. A dangerous one, Daniel observed without judgment. Yes, well, desperation doesn't always inspire wisdom, Mr. Lockhart. He nodded thoughtfully, then whistled. The chestnut stallion trotted over, its coat gleaming in the afternoon sun. This is Rusty, best horse in the Arizona Territory. The horse nuzzled Daniel's shoulder affectionately, then turned curious eyes toward Grace. She reached out slowly, letting the animal catch her scent before gently stroking his velvety nose. "He's beautiful," she murmured, "and strong enough to carry us both to Oatman. It's a mining town about 15 miles west of here. Not as big as Flagstaff, but they've got a decent hotel where you can rest and figure out your next move. Oatman, I've never heard of it. Gold mining town, rowdy in parts but decent enough folk overall." Daniel adjusted his hat. "I've got business there anyway. Was heading back when I saw you get thrown like a sack of flour." Grace felt her cheeks flush. "Not my finest moment. We all have days like that," he said kindly. "Question is, what comes after?" He extended a hand. "So, Miss O'Connor, will you ride with me to Oatman?" Grace looked at his outstretched hand, then at the vast, empty landscape surrounding them. She was alone in a territory she didn't know, without money or connections. This cowboy, this stranger, was offering help when he could have simply ridden on. Something in his steady gaze told her he could be trusted, at least for now. She placed her hand in his. "It seems I will, Mr. Lockhart. Thank you." With practiced ease, Daniel helped her mount Rusty, then swung up behind her. Grace tensed at the unfamiliar proximity, acutely aware of his chest against her back, his arms reaching around her to take the reins. "Relax," he said, his breath warm against her ear. "Rusty's gentle as they come, but he can sense if you're nervous." Grace forced herself to breathe deeply, to release some of the tension in her shoulders. "I've never ridden before," she admitted. "Chicago isn't exactly known for its horseback opportunities." Daniel's laugh rumbled through his chest. "Well then, Miss O'Connor, you're getting a proper Arizona welcome. Hold on tight to the saddle horn there." As they set off across the rugged landscape, Grace found herself adjusting to the rhythm of the horse's gait. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, but the movement created a breeze that cooled her face. For the first time since leaving Chicago, she felt a strange sense of freedom despite her circumstances. "May I ask what business brings you to Oatman, Mr. Lockhart?" she asked, breaking the comfortable silence that had fallen between them. "I run cattle about 30 miles north," he replied. "Come to town every couple of weeks for supplies and to sell beef to the mining companies." There was a pause before he added, "And it's Daniel." "Mr. Lockhart was my father." "Daniel," she repeated, testing the name. "And I'm Grace." "Grace," he said, and something about the way he spoke her name made her heart flutter unexpectedly. "It suits you." The sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and amber. Grace marveled at the beauty of this harsh land, so different from the crowded streets and sooty buildings of Chicago. "It's beautiful," she murmured, almost to herself. "That it is," Daniel agreed. "Dangerous too, but most beautiful things are, in my experience." As they rode, Daniel pointed out landmarks and plants, teaching her about the desert landscape. He showed her a tall saguaro cactus, explaining how it could live for 200 years. He identified hawks circling high overhead and told her about the coyotes that would soon begin their nightly chorus as the sun disappeared. "How long have you lived here?" Grace asked. "Born in Texas, but came to Arizona Territory with my father when I was 14. Been here 15 years now." He guided Rusty around a rocky outcropping. "Started with nothing but a few head of cattle and a dream. Now the Double L Ranch has one of the largest herds north of Oatman." "You've built something impressive," Grace said, hearing the pride in his voice. "Your parents must be proud." "Father passed 5 years back. Mother stayed in Texas with my sister's family." There was a note of old pain in his voice. "What about you? What did you leave behind in Chicago besides ghosts?" Grace considered the question. "Not much. I was a seamstress in a dress shop. After my parents died, I lost our home because I couldn't make the payments, sold most everything to buy the train ticket." She swallowed hard. "My uncle doesn't know I'm coming. I wrote to him, but there wasn't time for a reply before I had to leave." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "Life's got a way of sweeping the ground from under our feet, doesn't it?" "Indeed it does," Grace agreed softly. They crested a hill, and in the distance, Grace could see the scattered lights of a town nestled against Rocky Hill's Oatman, she presumed. As they drew closer, she could make out wooden buildings lining a main street, with smaller structures scattered up the hillsides. "It's not much," Daniel said, "but it's lively enough. Gold keeps the town flush. The hotel's decent clean beds and good food." "I have no money," Grace reminded him, the words bitter on her tongue. "Consider it a loan," Daniel said simply. "You can pay me back when you're on your feet again." Grace turned slightly in the saddle to look at him. "Why are you helping me? You don't know me." In the fading light, his expression was serious. "My father taught me never to ride past someone in need. Besides," a smile tugged at his mouth, "it's not every day a pretty woman falls from the sky into my arms." Grace felt heat rise to her cheeks again, but before she could respond, a gunshot echoed from the direction of the town, followed by several more in quick succession. Daniel instantly tensed behind her, his arm tightening around her waist as he pulled Rusty to a stop. "That's not good," he muttered, his eyes scanning the town below. "Sounds like trouble at the Golden Nugget Saloon." "Should we wait?" Grace asked, suddenly apprehensive about riding into unknown danger. Daniel hesitated, then shook his head. "It's nearly dark. Not safe to be out here with night coming on. We'll just steer clear of whatever nonsense is happening." He guided Rusty forward again, but at a more cautious pace. As they entered Oatman, Grace could see people gathered outside the saloon midway down the main street. A man's angry voice carried on the evening air, followed by more shouting. Daniel guided Rusty down a side street, giving the disturbance a wide berth. "The Oatman Hotel is just up ahead," he said, his voice low near her ear. "We'll get you settled there for the night." They stopped outside a 2-story wooden building with "Hotel" painted in large letters across its facade. Light spilled from the windows, and the sounds of piano music and conversation drifted from within. Daniel dismounted first, then reached up to help Grace down. Her legs felt wobbly after the long ride, and she gripped his arms for support. "First ride's always the hardest," he said with a sympathetic smile. "You'll be walking like a cowhand by morning." He tied Rusty to the hitching post and offered Grace his arm. "Let me handle the arrangements," he said quietly as they entered the hotel. The lobby was small but clean, with a polished wooden counter and a pot-bellied stove in one corner. A bald man with spectacles looked up from his ledger as they entered. "Evening, Mr. Lockhart," he said, his curious gaze moving to Grace. "Didn't expect to see you back in town so soon." "Change of plans, Mr. Hobson," Daniel replied smoothly. "This is Miss Grace O'Connor. She needs a room for the night." Mr. Hobson's eyebrows rose slightly, and Grace felt herself bristle at what he might be thinking. "Miss O'Connor is traveling to Flagstaff to stay with her uncle," Daniel continued, his tone leaving no room for misinterpretation. "She had some trouble with her journey and I offered assistance." Of course," Mr. Hobson said, reaching for a key. "Room 8 is available, miss. One of our nicest, has a view of the hills." "Thank you," Grace said, finding her voice. "I appreciate your hospitality." Daniel placed money on the counter. "Also for breakfast in the morning," he added. Mr. Hobson nodded, making a note in his ledger. "Dining room opens at 6. Will you be needing a room as well, Mr. Lockhart?" "No, I'll be staying at my usual place with Mrs. Fincher." He turned to Grace. "Her boarding house is just down the street. I help her with repairs when I'm in town, so she keeps a room for me." Mr. Hobson handed Grace the key. "Up the stairs and to the right, miss. There's a washroom at the end of the hall. Pump in the back if you need fresh water." "Thank you," Grace said again, clutching the key. Daniel escorted her to the stairs. "Get some rest," he said. "I'll come by in the morning and we can talk about getting you to Flagstaff." Grace looked up at him, this stranger who had saved her life and shown her nothing but kindness. "I don't know how to thank you properly." His smile was gentle. "No need, anyone would have done the same." "No," Grace said firmly. "They wouldn't have." Something passed between them then, a moment of understanding that went beyond words. Daniel cleared his throat, breaking the spell. "Sleep well, Grace. You're safe here." As she climbed the stairs to her room, Grace felt the weight of the day's events settling on her shoulders. She had nearly died. She was still hundreds of miles from her destination. She had no money and no clear path forward. Yet somehow, for the first time since her parents' deaths, she didn't feel completely alone. The room was simple but comfortable, with a narrow bed, a washstand with a porcelain basin, a small dresser, and a chair by the window. Grace moved to the window and looked out at the town of Oatman, its buildings now mere silhouettes against the darkening sky. Somewhere down there, Daniel Lockhart was walking to his boarding house, going about his life, a life that had unexpectedly collided with hers. She had no idea what tomorrow would bring. But for tonight, at least, she had a roof over her head and the memory of strong arms catching her when she fell. Morning arrived with harsh brilliance, sunlight streaming through the threadbare curtains of Grace's hotel room. For a moment she was disoriented, the unfamiliar surroundings confusing her sleep-muddled mind. Then the events of the previous day came rushing back: the train, her desperate attempt to reach Flagstaff, being thrown into the air, and the cowboy who had caught her, Daniel Lockhart. A stranger who had shown her more kindness in a few hours than she'd experienced in the months since her parents' deaths. Grace rose and went to the washstand, pouring water from the pitcher into the basin. The cool water was refreshing against her face, helping to clear away the last cobwebs of sleep. Her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand showed a young woman with tired eyes and tangled chestnut hair. 22 years old and already acquainted with more hardship than some faced in a lifetime. She did her best to make herself presentable, repinning her hair and brushing the dust from her blue dress, the same one she'd worn yesterday, and for several days before that. Her small carpet bag contained only one change of clothes, which she was saving for when she reached Flagstaff. If she reached Flagstaff, a knock at the door startled her. "Miss O'Connor, it's Daniel Lockhart." Grace opened the door to find Daniel standing there, hat in hand, looking freshly shaven and more handsome than she remembered. He wore a clean white shirt under his leather vest, and his dark hair was still damp from washing. "Good morning," he said, his smile warming his blue eyes. "I hope you slept well." "Better than I expected," she admitted. "Thank you for arranging the room." "My pleasure. I thought you might be ready for some breakfast. The hotel dining room serves a decent meal." Grace's stomach growled at the mention of food, and she realized she hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. "That sounds wonderful." As they descended the stairs to the dining room, Grace was acutely aware of the curious glances from other hotel guests. A young woman alone with a cowboy was bound to raise eyebrows, even in a frontier town like Oatman. The dining room was half full, mostly with men in mining clothes or business suits. A few women were scattered among them, wearing simple dresses similar to Grace's own. A waitress led them to a small table near a window and handed them each a menu. "Coffee?" she asked, already pouring the dark liquid into their cups without waiting for an answer. "Thank you," Grace said, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. "This is exactly what I needed." "Food will help too," Daniel said. "The flapjacks here are particularly good." They ordered flapjacks for both of them, with bacon and eggs for Daniel, and settled into an awkward silence. Grace took a sip of her coffee, using the moment to gather her thoughts. "Mr. Lockhart, Daniel," she began, "I need to be clear about something. I have no means to repay your kindness immediately. When I reach my uncle in Flagstaff, I'm sure he'll help, but until then—" Daniel held up a hand to stop her. "I didn't help you expecting repayment, Grace. Nevertheless, I don't like being in debt. I was raised to stand on my own 2 feet. He studied her for a moment, appreciation in his gaze. "I respect that. But sometimes accepting help isn't weakness, it's just good sense." The waitress returned with their food, and Grace's mouth watered at the sight of the golden flapjacks drizzled with maple syrup. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes, Grace savoring each bite of the best meal she'd had in weeks. "I've been thinking about your situation," Daniel said finally, setting down his fork. "The next train to Flagstaff doesn't come through for 3 days. Grace's heart sank. 3 days, but I have no way to. "I have a proposition," Daniel interrupted. "I'm heading back to my ranch today. It's a day's ride north of here. I have business in Flagstaff next week, cattle contract negotiations. You could stay at the ranch until then, help out a bit to earn your keep if you want, and then I'll take you to Flagstaff myself." Grace stared at him, surprised by the offer. "Stay at your ranch? But you hardly know me." "My housekeeper, Mrs. Morales, lives there too. She's a proper chaperone if that's your concern." His expression grew serious. "Look, Grace, a young woman alone in a mining town isn't safe, and 3 days in a hotel would cost more than you could earn in that time." Grace considered his words. The prospect of being stranded in Oatman for 3 days was daunting. But going to a stranger's ranch, miles from anywhere, carried its own risks. Yet something about Daniel inspired trust. He'd had ample opportunity to take advantage of her vulnerable position but had shown nothing but respect. "Your ranch," she said carefully. "How large is it?" 5,000 acres. 200 head of cattle, small house but comfortable enough." Pride tinged his voice. "Built it myself when I first claimed the land. And Mrs. Morales, she lives in the house. Has her own room off the kitchen. Been with me for 3 years now since her husband passed. She's from Sonora originally, makes the best tortillas you'll ever taste." He smiled. "She's always saying the place needs a woman's touch beyond what she can provide." Grace took another sip of her coffee, weighing her options. 3 days in Oatman with no money and nowhere to go versus a week at Daniel's ranch with honest work and a guaranteed ride to Flagstaff afterward. "If I accept," she said slowly, "I insist on working for my room and board. I can cook, clean, mend clothes. I'm a skilled seamstress." Daniel's smile widened. "Mrs. Morales would appreciate the help, I'm sure. She's been after me to find someone to take on some of the household duties." "She's not as young as she once was." Grace extended her hand across the table. "Then we have an agreement, Mr. Lockhart. I'll stay at your ranch until you travel to Flagstaff, working to earn my keep." Daniel took her hand, his calloused palm warm against hers. "We have an agreement, Miss O'Connor." They finished their breakfast, discussing practical matters. Daniel needed to purchase supplies before they left town: flour, coffee, sugar, and other staples that were running low at the ranch. Grace would accompany him on these errands, then they would ride north. "It'll be a long ride," he warned as they left the dining room. "Harder than yesterday. You sure you're up for it?" Grace thought of the alternative, remaining in Oatman alone, vulnerable with no resources. "I'll manage," she said firmly. "Though I suspect I'll be rather sore tomorrow," Daniel laughed. "No doubt about that, but Mrs. Morales has a remedy she swears by, some concoction of herbs and tequila. Smells terrible but works wonders." They stepped out onto the street, which was already bustling with morning activity. Wagons rumbled past, miners headed to their claims in the hills, and shopkeepers arranged displays outside their establishments. "First stop, general store," Daniel said, offering his arm. "Then the feed store for Rusty." Grace took his arm, aware again of the curious glances from passers-by. In her simple traveling dress, she knew she stood out as a newcomer. Daniel, however, greeted several people by name as they walked, clearly well known in the small community. The general store was a cavernous space filled with everything from mining supplies to canned goods to ready-made clothing. While Daniel discussed his order with the proprietor, Grace wandered the aisles, running her fingers over bolts of fabric and examining household items she hadn't seen since leaving Chicago. "Find something you fancy?" Daniel asked, appearing at her side as she examined a simple but pretty blue bonnet. Grace hastily put it down. "Just looking. It's been a while since I've been in a proper store." Daniel's eyes moved from her to the bonnet and back again. Without comment, he returned to the counter to complete his transaction. A few minutes later, they left the store, Daniel carrying a list of items that would be packaged for pickup before their departure. The feed store was their next stop, where Daniel arranged for grain for his horse. Grace waited outside, watching the townspeople go about their business. Oatman was smaller than she'd expected, but had a certain frontier charm. The buildings were a mix of rough-hewn lumber and adobe, with hitching posts lining the street and wooden sidewalks providing refuge from the dusty road. "Well, well, what have we here?" A slurred voice interrupted her observations. "New face in town, and a pretty one at that." Grace turned to find a man in his 30s, unshaven and smelling strongly of whiskey despite the early hour. His bloodshot eyes roamed over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "Excuse me," she said coolly, attempting to step around him. He moved to block her path. "Now don't be like that, darling, just being friendly. What brings you to Oatman? Looking for company?" He reached out to touch her arm. "The lady's with me, Willard." Daniel's voice cut through the morning air like a whip. He stood in the doorway of the feed store, his posture deceptively relaxed, but his eyes hard as flint. "And she's not interested in whatever you're offering." The man Willard squinted at Daniel, recognition slowly dawning on his face. "Lockhart, didn't see you there." He backed up a step, hands raised. "No harm intended, just making conversation." "Make it elsewhere," Daniel suggested, his tone leaving no room for argument. Willard glanced between them, then shuffled away, muttering under his breath. Daniel moved to Grace's side, his expression softening. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said, though her heart was still racing. "Thank you." "Willard Johnson," Daniel explained as they continued down the street. "Spends more time in the saloon than the mine he claims to work. Harmless mostly, but doesn't know when to leave well enough alone." "Is that what the shooting was about last night?" Grace asked. "Likely. There's always someone picking a fight at the Golden Nugget." He guided her toward a small cafe. "One more stop before we collect my supplies. Mrs. Morales asked for some spices from Mrs. Rivera's shop here. Best place for authentic Mexican ingredients in Oatman." The cafe was small but inviting, with colorful curtains in the windows and the enticing aroma of cooking spices filling the air. A plump woman with silver-streaked black hair greeted Daniel warmly in Spanish, then switched to English when she noticed Grace. "And who is this lovely señorita?" she asked, her dark eyes twinkling. "Mrs. Rivera, this is Miss Grace O'Connor," Daniel said. "She'll be staying at the ranch for a time, helping Mrs. Morales." "Ah, Elena will be so pleased. She has been saying for years that the house needs a woman's touch." Mrs. Rivera beamed at Grace. "You are from the East, yes. I can tell by your complexion, not yet kissed by our Arizona sun." "Chicago," Grace confirmed with a smile, warming to the woman's friendly manner. "Well, our son will soon remedy that. But here—" Mrs. Rivera disappeared behind a curtain and returned with a small jar. "A cream my grandmother taught me to make. Aloe and beeswax. It will protect your skin." When Grace began to protest that she couldn't pay, Mrs. Rivera waved her off. "A gift. Any friend of Daniel's is welcome here." While Daniel selected the spices Mrs. Morales had requested, Mrs. Rivera engaged Grace in conversation, asking about her journey and sharing stories of her own arrival in Oatman 20 years earlier as a young bride. "It was nothing but tents and dreams back then," she said, wrapping Daniel's purchases in brown paper. "Now look at us, almost civilized." She laughed heartily at her own joke. With their errands complete, they returned to the general store to collect Daniel's supplies. The proprietor had everything packaged and ready, the items neatly arranged in burlap sacks that could be tied to Rusty's saddle. As Daniel settled his account, Grace noticed a small package among the items that she didn't recall him selecting, a familiar shape wrapped in brown paper. "What's this?" she asked as they left the store, Daniel carrying the supplies. "Just a little something extra," he said, not meeting her eyes. "We should get going if we want to reach the ranch before dark." They retrieved Rusty from the stable behind the hotel, where Daniel had left him the night before. The chestnut stallion greeted his master with an affectionate nudge, then regarded Grace with curiosity. "He remembers you," Daniel said, stroking the horse's neck. "That's a good sign." With practiced efficiency, Daniel secured their supplies to the saddle, then helped Grace mount. The process was less awkward than the day before, though Grace still felt unsteady on the horse's broad back. Daniel swung up behind her, and they set off through town toward the northern trail. As they passed the hotel, Grace gazed up at the window of the room where she'd spent the night, wondering if she was making the right decision. She was literally putting her life in the hands of a man she'd known for less than a day, riding into unfamiliar territory far from civilization. Yet the alternative, remaining in Oatman alone and penniless, seemed far riskier. And something about Daniel Lockhart inspired trust. Perhaps it was the way he had caught her when she fell, or how he had handled the situation with Willard without resorting to violence, or the respect other townspeople clearly had for him. Whatever it was, Grace found herself surprisingly content with her decision as they left Oatman behind and headed into the open country. The landscape was both beautiful and forbidding, rugged hills giving way to stretches of desert, dotted with cacti and scrub brush. In the distance, mountains rose against the horizon, their peaks still bearing traces of winter snow despite the warmth of the spring day. "That's the Black Mountains," Daniel explained, following her gaze. "The ranch sits in their shadow. There's a year-round spring that feeds the creek on my property, the reason I settled there. Water's more valuable than gold out here." As they rode, Daniel pointed out features of the landscape and shared stories of his early days in the territory. He had arrived with his father in 1870, just 15 years old but already skilled with horses and cattle from their years in Texas. They had started with a small herd and gradually built the Double L Ranch into one of the most successful operations in the area. "Father always dreamed of seeing the ranch flourish," Daniel said, a note of melancholy in his voice. He passed before we reached 200 head, would have been proud to see it now. He would be, Grace agreed softly. You've built something significant. Daniel was quiet for a moment. What about your parents? What were they like? Grace hadn't spoken much about her parents since their deaths, the grief still too raw. But something about the vast openness surrounding them made it easier to open up. Father was a bookkeeper for a shipping company on the Chicago River. Precise, methodical, always had ink stains on his fingers. She smiled at the memory. Mother taught piano to children from wealthy families. She loved music. Our small home was always filled with it. They sound like good people. They were. They worked hard to give me and my brother opportunities they never had. Grace swallowed against the lump forming in her throat. William, my brother, died in '82, pneumonia. He was just 19. Daniel's arm tightened briefly around her waist, a gesture of comfort. I'm sorry. That's a heavy burden of loss to bear. It is, Grace acknowledged. After Mother and Father passed, there was nothing left for me in Chicago. My Uncle Father's brother is the only family I have left. We've never met, but Father spoke well of him. Said Uncle George was the adventurous one, heading west while Father stayed in the city. Family's important, Daniel said. Mine's scattered now. Mother in Texas with my sister Martha and her brood, brother Thomas ranching in Montana Territory. Haven't seen them in years. The conversation flowed easily between them as the hours passed, the rhythmic motion of the horse lulling Grace into a sense of comfort despite the physical discomfort of the ride. By midday, her back ached and her legs felt stiff, but she was determined not to complain. They stopped to rest by a small stream around noon. Daniel helped Grace dismount, steadying her when her legs threatened to buckle. Saddle sore already? He asked, sympathy in his eyes. I'll manage, Grace insisted, though she couldn't help wincing as she took a few stiff steps. Daniel spread a blanket in the shade of a cottonwood tree and unpacked a simple lunch of bread, cheese, and jerky that Mrs. Rivera had prepared for them. Grace sank onto the blanket gratefully, stretching her legs out in front of her. It gets easier, Daniel promised, handing her a canteen of water. By the time we ride to Flagstaff, you'll be comfortable in the saddle. I hope so, Grace said, taking a sip of the cool water. Though I admit I'm looking forward to a proper stagecoach or train for the remainder of my journey. Daniel chuckled, settling beside her on the blanket. The stagecoach might change your mind. Those things bounce worse than a bucking bronco. They ate in companionable silence, watching Rusty drink from the stream. The sun was high overhead, casting dappled shadows through the cottonwood leaves. Desert birds called to one another from the scrub brush, and a slight breeze carried the scent of sage. It's peaceful here, Grace observed. Different from Chicago. There, you can never escape the noise, carriages, factories, people everywhere. Too many people for my taste, Daniel said. Out here, a man can breathe, can hear himself think. Is that why you came west? To breathe? Daniel considered the question. Partly. Mostly followed my father's dream. He always said there was opportunity out here for those willing to work hard and take risks. He glanced at her. What about you? Once you reach your uncle, what then? Grace had asked herself the same question many times. I'm not sure, she admitted. I hope to find work, perhaps as a seamstress again, save enough to establish myself. No thoughts of marriage, family of your own. The question was casual, but Grace sensed a genuine curiosity behind it. Someday, perhaps, but I've seen too many women rush into marriage out of necessity rather than affection. She met his gaze directly. I won't be dependent on anyone again if I can help it. Daniel nodded slowly. Independence is valuable, but so is having someone to share your burdens. He began packing away the remains of their lunch. We should continue if we want to reach the ranch by nightfall. The rest of the journey was arduous for Grace, her body protesting the hours in the saddle. But the changing landscape provided distraction from her discomfort. As they traveled north, the terrain became less arid, with more vegetation dotting the hills. They followed what Daniel called game trails, paths worn by deer and other wildlife that provided easier passage than the rugged land around them. By late afternoon, they crested a ridge and Daniel reined Rusty to a stop. "There it is," he said, his voice filled with quiet pride. "Double L Ranch." Below them stretched a valley, green with spring growth, nestled against the foothills of the mountains. A creek meandered through the center, its banks lined with cottonwoods and willows. Cattle grazed on the rich grass, dark shapes scattered across the landscape. Near the creek stood a ranch house not large, but solidly built of logs and stone with several outbuildings nearby. A corral held a few horses, and smoke rose from the chimney of the main house. "It's beautiful," Grace said sincerely. "Home," Daniel replied simply. He urged Rusty forward, down the slope toward the valley. As they approached the ranch, a dog's bark alerted the household to their arrival. A border collie raced from the direction of the barn, followed by a tall, lean man in his 50s who shaded his eyes against the setting sun to watch their approach. "Looks like Sam's back from checking the north pasture," Daniel observed. Sam Mitchell, my foreman. Been with me since the beginning. Best cattleman I know." They rode into the yard and Daniel dismounted before helping Grace down. Her legs nearly gave way and she clutched his arms for support. "Steady," he murmured, keeping a hand at her waist until she found her balance. Sam approached, his weathered face curious as he took in the sight of Grace. "Welcome back, boss," he said, his eyes never leaving Grace. "Didn't expect company." "Sam, this is Miss Grace O'Connor," Daniel said. "She'll be staying with us until I go to Flagstaff next week." "Miss O'Connor, my foreman, Sam Mitchell." "Madam," Sam said, touching the brim of his hat respectfully. "Welcome to Double L." "Thank you, Mr. Mitchell," Grace replied, straightening her spine despite her discomfort. "It's a pleasure to meet you." The door of the ranch house opened, and a short, stout woman with iron-gray hair emerged, wiping her hands on her apron. Her dark eyes widened at the sight of Grace. "Daniel Lockhart, who is this you bring to my kitchen without warning?" she called, her voice carrying a hint of Spanish accent. Daniel grinned. "Mrs. Morales, meet Miss Grace O'Connor. She'll be helping you for the next week." "Helping me?" The housekeeper descended the steps, her expression a mix of surprise and curiosity. "Dios mío, the girl looks ready to fall over. What have you done to her, riding all day?" "I'm fine, truly," Grace tried to assure her, though in truth her legs felt like jelly and her back screamed in protest at every movement. Mrs. Morales clicked her tongue disapprovingly. "Fine," she says. "Come, Nina, inside with you. A hot meal and my special remedy will set you right." She shot Daniel a reproachful look. Men, no consideration for delicate constitutions. Despite her protests, Grace found herself ushered into the ranch house, Mrs. Morales's firm hand on her elbow guiding her through the door. Behind them, she heard Daniel's warm laughter and Sam's questions about the trip to Oatman. The interior of the house was simpler than Grace had expected, but comfortable and immaculately clean. The main room served as both parlor and dining area, with a large stone fireplace along one wall, a sturdy wooden table surrounded by chairs, and a few pieces of well-crafted furniture. Bookshelves lined another wall, filled with volumes that surprised Grace with their variety: novels, poetry, history, and practical guides to ranching and agriculture. "This way," Mrs. Morales directed, leading Grace through to a small but well-appointed kitchen at the back of the house. Sit." You look dead on your feet." Grace sank gratefully onto a chair at the kitchen table, her muscles protesting even this simple movement. "Now," Mrs. Morales said, placing her hands on her ample hips, "Daniel says you will help me. What does this mean? And where did he find you?" "That man, always bringing strays home, injured calves, orphaned foals, now a young lady." But despite her words, her eyes were kind. Briefly, Grace explained her situation, her journey from Chicago, being thrown from the train, Daniel's rescue, and their agreement. Mrs. Morales listened without interruption, her expressive face showing shock, sympathy, and finally approval. "So," she said when Grace finished, "you wish to work for your keep. This is good, I respect this." She moved to the stove, where something fragrant simmered in a large pot. "But first, food. Then my special remedy for the aches. Tomorrow is soon enough to begin work." Grace's stomach rumbled at the delicious aroma filling the kitchen. "Whatever you're cooking smells wonderful. Paso pork and hominy stew, my grandmother's recipe." Mrs. Morales stirred the pot, then reached for a ladle. "Daniel loves it, says it puts meat on his bones." She glanced at Grace appraisingly. "You could use some meat on your bones too, Nina." Before Grace could respond, the back door opened and Daniel entered, carrying her carpetbag and the packages from Oatman. "Sam's seeing to Rusty," he said, setting Grace's bag by her chair. "Mrs. Morales, I brought the spices you asked for and a few other things from town." "Gracias," the housekeeper said, accepting the package he handed her. "Now out of my kitchen. Miss O'Connor needs to eat and rest. You can talk business tomorrow." Daniel raised his eyebrows, amusement dancing in his eyes. "Yes, madam." To Grace he added, "Mrs. Morales rules this house with an iron fist. Best to do as she says." "Sensible advice," Grace agreed with a smile. With a nod, Daniel withdrew, leaving Grace in Mrs. Morales's capable hands. The housekeeper served a bowl of the rich stew with a side of fresh tortillas. Grace hadn't realized how hungry she was until the food was before her. She ate with appreciation, savoring flavors she'd never experienced in Chicago. "This is delicious," she said between bites. "I've never had anything like it." Mrs. Morales beamed with pleasure. "Mexican food. Real food, not like what they call cooking in the East." She sat opposite Grace with her own bowl. "So you are a seamstress. This is good. Daniel's shirts need mending and Sam's too. These men, they work hard, wear through clothing like paper." "I'd be happy to help with mending," Grace said. "And whatever else needs doing. I can cook, though not dishes like this, and I'm a quick learner." Mrs. Morales nodded approvingly. "Good attitude. Tomorrow I show you the house, what needs doing. But tonight," she rose and moved to a cupboard, extracting a dark bottle and a small jar of what looked like herbal paste. "Tonight we fix these aches so you can sleep." The remedy, as Daniel had warned, smelled terrible, a pungent mixture of herbs, tequila, and what Mrs. Morales would only describe as special ingredients. But after a hot bath in the small washroom off the kitchen, a luxury Grace hadn't expected on a frontier ranch, the application of the remedy to her sore muscles and a cup of strong tea laced with honey, Grace felt remarkably better. Mrs. Morales showed her to a small but neat bedroom upstairs. "Daniel's room is there," she said, pointing to a door at the end of the hall. "Mine is downstairs by the kitchen. Sam has quarters in the bunkhouse with the other hands." The room contained a narrow bed with a colorful quilt, a small dresser, a washstand, and a rocking chair by the window. Fresh wildflowers stood in a jar on the dresser, a welcoming touch that brought unexpected tears to Grace's eyes. "I put clean linens on the bed," Mrs. Morales said. "Tomorrow we find you something else to wear. That dress has seen better days, yes." "Yes," Grace agreed, embarrassed by her limited wardrobe. I have one change of clothes in my bag, but that's all." Mrs. Morales patted her arm. "Do not worry, we will manage." She moved to the door. "Rest well, Nina. Morning comes early on a ranch." Left alone, Grace unpacked her meager possessions: a simple nightgown, a change of undergarments, her second dress, a hairbrush, and a small framed photograph of her parents. She placed the photograph on the dresser, changed into her nightgown, and climbed into the bed, expecting to fall asleep instantly after the exhausting day. But despite her physical fatigue, her mind was active, reviewing the extraordinary events that had brought her to this place. 2 days ago, she had been desperately boarding a train without a ticket, certain that Flagstaff and her uncle represented her only hope for a future. Now she was in a comfortable bed in a ranch house miles from anywhere, having agreed to spend a week working for a man she barely knew. A man who had saved her life. A man whose blue eyes held both kindness and secrets. A man who had bought her a bonnet without being asked and arranged everything so carefully to preserve her dignity. Grace turned on her side, gazing out the window at the star-filled sky. Whatever came next, she was safe for now. And in a world that had shown her little kindness recently, that was no small thing. She closed her eyes, finally surrendering to sleep, as somewhere in the distance a coyote called to the night. Morning arrived with a chorus of roosters and the smell of coffee drifting up the stairs. Grace woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was. The unfamiliar ceiling above her, the firm mattress beneath, the distant sounds of men's voices and livestock, none of it matched her memories of Chicago or her brief stay in Oatman. Then it came back to her. The ranch, Daniel Lockhart, her agreement to work for her keep until they traveled to Flagstaff. With a soft groan, she sat up, her muscles protesting the movement. Mrs. Morales's remedy had helped, but she was still sore from the long ride. Light streamed through the small window, telling her it was well into morning. She had overslept. Hastily, she rose and dressed in her second outfit, a simple gray skirt and white shirtwaist that had seen better days but was at least clean. She brushed her hair and pinned it up as neatly as she could, wanting to make a good impression on her first real day at the ranch. Downstairs, she found Mrs. Morales in the kitchen, kneading dough at the table. The older woman looked up with a smile. "Ah, Sleeping Beauty wakes. How do you feel this morning?" "Much better, thank you," Grace said, though in truth every movement reminded her of yesterday's ride. "I'm sorry to have slept so late." Mrs. Morales waved a flour-covered hand dismissively. "Nonsense. You needed rest. Daniel said to let you sleep." She nodded toward the stove. "Coffee is hot. Breakfast is keeping warm in the oven: eggs, bacon, biscuits." Grace poured herself a cup of the strong black coffee and retrieved the plate from the oven, touched by the thoughtfulness. "This is very kind, thank you. Eat. Then I show you what needs doing." Grace sat at the table, enjoying the simple but hearty breakfast while Mrs. Morales continued kneading what appeared to be bread dough. "Where is everyone?" she asked between bites. "Daniel and the men left at dawn to move cattle to the north pasture. Spring roundup begins next week, so much to do before then." The housekeeper punched the dough with surprising vigor. "They return for midday meal. After breakfast, Mrs. Morales gave Grace a tour of the ranch house and outlined the daily chores: laundry, cleaning, meal preparation, and yes, mending the seemingly endless pile of torn shirts, pants, and socks that the ranch hands generated. "Men, Mrs. Morales exclaimed, showing Grace a shirt with a sleeve nearly torn off. "They think clothes mend themselves. Before you came, I could not keep up. My eyes not so good for close work anymore." "I'm happy to take on the mending," Grace assured her, examining the damaged garment with a professional eye. "This is an easy fix." The morning passed quickly as Grace set to work. She started with the mending while Mrs. Morales baked bread and prepared a hearty stew for the midday meal. The work was familiar and soothing, each neat stitch helping to restore her sense of purpose and usefulness. Around noon, the sound of horses and men's voices announced the return of Daniel and the ranch hands. Grace felt a flutter of nervousness as boots stomped on the porch and the door opened, admitting Daniel, Sam, and 3 other men she hadn't met. "Something smells mighty fine, Mrs. M," one of the men called as they entered, removing their hats and hanging them on pegs by the door. Daniel's eyes found Grace immediately where she sat near the window, a pile of mending in her lap. Something in his expression warmed as he crossed the room to her. "You're looking better today," he said. "Did you sleep well?" "Very well, thank you," Grace replied, setting aside her work and rising. "Your home is most comfortable," Daniel smiled. "Glad to hear it." He turned to introduce the other men. "You've met Sam. This is Pete Wilson, my best roper, Tom Barker, who keeps our horses in fine shape, and Jake Miller, newest addition to the Double L." The men nodded or touched their foreheads in greeting, their curious gazes taking in Grace's presence. "Miss O'Connor will be staying with us until next week," Daniel explained simply. "She's helping Mrs. Morales with the house." No further explanation seemed necessary. The men washed up at the basin by the back door, then took their places at the large table as Mrs. Morales began bringing out the food, the savory stew, fresh bread still warm from the oven, and a mountain of boiled potatoes. Grace moved to help, carrying dishes to the table and filling water glasses. She was acutely aware of the men watching her, particularly Daniel, whose gaze she could feel like a physical touch whenever she passed near him. The meal was a lively affair, with the men discussing the morning's work, plans for the upcoming roundup, and news from neighboring ranches. Grace remained quiet, observing the easy camaraderie among them. This was Daniel's world, practical, physical, bound by the rhythms of the seasons and the needs of the livestock. So different from the life she had known in Chicago. After the meal, the men returned to their work, and Grace helped Mrs. Morales clear the table and wash the dishes. As she was drying the last plate, Daniel reappeared in the kitchen doorway. "Grace," he said, "if you're not too busy, I thought you might like to see the rest of the ranch. It's a fine afternoon for a tour." "I'd like that," Grace said, looking to Mrs. Morales for permission. The housekeeper smiled knowingly. "Go, go, the mending will wait. Young people should be in the sunshine." Daniel led Grace outside where 2 horses waited, saddled and ready. One was Rusty, the other a smaller, dappled gray mare. "This is Daisy," Daniel said, stroking the mare's nose. "Gentlest horse on the ranch. I thought you might prefer to ride on your own today rather than doubling up again." Grace eyed the mare with trepidation. She had never ridden alone before. "I'm not sure I know how." "She'll do most of the work," Daniel assured her. "Just hold the reins like this," he demonstrated, "and use your legs to guide her. Gentle pressure, that's all she needs." With Daniel's help, Grace mounted the mare, feeling unsteady at first but gradually finding her balance. Daniel showed her how to hold the reins properly and gave her a few basic instructions on guiding the horse. "We'll take it slow," he promised, mounting Rusty. "Just follow my lead." They set off at a walk, Daniel keeping Rusty to a pace that Daisy could easily match. Grace was tense at first, gripping the saddle horn with white knuckles. But as they continued and nothing terrible happened, she began to relax and even enjoy the experience. Daniel led her on a circuit of the ranch, showing her the creek that provided water year-round, the lush pastures where the cattle grazed, the small orchard of apple and peach trees he had planted near the house, and the garden plot where Mrs. Morales grew vegetables in the summer months. It's larger than I expected, Grace commented as they paused on a ridge overlooking the property. You've accomplished so much. Daniel gazed out over his land, pride evident in his expression. It wasn't easy. First few years were the hardest drought, rustlers, wolves taking calves. There were times I thought about giving up, heading back to Texas with my tail between my legs. What kept you going? He was quiet for a moment. Stubborn pride mostly, didn't want to admit defeat. And this land, he gestured to the vista before them, there's something about it that gets under your skin, becomes part of you. Grace could understand that. Even in the short time she'd been here, she had begun to appreciate the stark beauty of the landscape, the vastness of the sky, the sense of possibility that seemed to hover just beyond the horizon. "What about you?" Daniel asked, turning in his saddle to face her. "What kept you going after losing your family? Would have been easier to stay in Chicago, find a husband, let someone else shoulder the burden." Grace considered the question. "Pride, I suppose, like you, and fear of depending on someone who might disappoint me or worse." She met his gaze. "My friend Marion married in haste after her parents died. Her husband seemed kind at first, but once they were wed." She shook her head. "I promised myself I would never be that vulnerable." "Not all men are like that," Daniel said quietly. "No," Grace agreed. "But a woman in my position can't afford to make mistakes." They rode in silence for a time, each lost in their own thoughts. The afternoon sun cast long shadows as they turned back toward the ranch house. "There's something I've been meaning to give you," Daniel said as they approached the barn. He reached into his saddlebag and withdrew the small package Grace had noticed among the supplies in Oatman. "It's nothing much, but practical." Grace took the package, already suspecting what it contained. Unwrapping the brown paper, she found the blue bonnet she had admired in the general store. "Daniel, you shouldn't have. The sun out here is fierce," he said matter-of-factly. "It'll protect your skin. Mrs. Morales would say it's practical, not frivolous." Grace ran her fingers over the simple but pretty bonnet, touched by his thoughtfulness. "Thank you, it's lovely." Daniel ducked his head, seemingly embarrassed by her gratitude. "Like I said, practical." He dismounted and moved to help her down from Daisy. His hands spanned her waist as he lifted her easily to the ground, and for a moment they stood close enough that Grace could see the flecks of gray in his blue eyes. "I should help Mrs. Morales with dinner," Grace said, stepping back, suddenly flustered. "Of course." Daniel's hands fell away. "I'll see to the horses." Grace hurried back to the house, the bonnet clutched in her hands, her heart beating a rapid tattoo against her ribs. What was happening to her? She had known this man for barely 2 days, yet his proximity affected her in ways she hadn't expected. It was foolish, dangerous even to allow such feelings to develop. In a week, she would be in Flagstaff and Daniel Lockhart would return to his ranch, their paths diverging. Yet as she entered the kitchen, where Mrs. Morales was chopping vegetables for the evening meal, Grace couldn't help touching the bonnet again, a small smile tugging at her lips. Mrs. Morales glanced up, her sharp eyes missing nothing. "Ah," she said knowingly. "A gift from Daniel, a practical one," Grace said quickly. "For the son." She, very practical." Mrs. Morales's tone was teasing. "Daniel is a practical man, except when he buys pretty bonnets for pretty girls." She returned to her chopping, humming a Spanish melody. Grace felt her cheeks warm. "It's nothing like that, he's simply being kind." "Kind, yes. Daniel is kind." The housekeeper fixed Grace with a pointed look. "But in 15 years I have not seen him bring any woman to this ranch, except old Mrs. Fincher when she delivers eggs. Until you." "He's only helping me reach my uncle," Grace protested, though she felt a strange flutter at Mrs. Morales's words. "As you say." The housekeeper's tone made it clear she believed otherwise. "Now, help me with these potatoes, Nina. Men will be hungry after their day's work." The days fell into a rhythm as Grace settled into life at the Double L Ranch. Each morning, she rose early to help Mrs. Morales prepare breakfast for the ranch hands. The days were filled with household tasks: cooking, cleaning, laundry, and the seemingly endless mending. In the evenings, after dinner, she often sat by the fire in the main room, working on particularly challenging repairs while Daniel read from one of his many books or calculated figures in his ledger. It was a simple life, governed by the sun's rising and setting, but Grace found unexpected contentment in its predictability and purpose. Her muscles grew accustomed to the physical labor, and her skin began to take on a golden hue from brief periods spent outdoors. Daniel was often busy with ranch work, but he made time each day to check on Grace, to ensure she had everything she needed. Sometimes he would bring her small tokens from his daily rides: a particularly beautiful wildflower, an interesting rock, once a perfect eagle feather. These gifts were always presented casually, with practical explanations, but Grace treasured each one, keeping them arranged on her dresser beside the photograph of her parents. On her fourth day at the ranch, Daniel found Grace in the garden behind the house, where she was helping Mrs. Morales plant vegetables for the summer harvest. The sun was warm on her shoulders, and she wore the blue bonnet to protect her face from its rays. "You look at home in a garden," Daniel observed, leaning against the fence that kept rabbits from the precious plants. Grace looked up, brushing soil from her hands. "My mother kept a small garden behind our house in Chicago. Not much, just a few flowers and herbs, but she loved it. Said it reminded her of her childhood in Pennsylvania. Mrs. Morales working you too hard?" His tone was light, but his eyes held genuine concern. "Not at all," Grace assured him. "I enjoy being useful. Sitting idle has never suited me." Mrs. Morales straightened from where she had been planting carrots. "She is a good worker, this one," she said approvingly. "Fast hands, smart head." She squinted at the sun. "But enough for today. Time to start dinner." "Actually," Daniel said, "that's why I came to find you. I thought maybe Grace might like to join me for a ride first. There's a place I'd like to show her before the light fades." Mrs. Morales's eyes twinkled. "Go, go." "I manage dinner myself. Young people should enjoy the spring evening." She made shooing motions with her hands. "Would you like to?" Daniel asked Grace. "It's not far and Daisy could use the exercise." Grace found herself nodding before she had fully considered the invitation. "I'd like that. Just let me wash up first." A short while later, they were riding side by side across the ranch, Grace now much more comfortable on horseback than she had been just days ago. Daniel led them toward the foothills of the mountains, following a narrow trail that wound through stands of juniper and pine. "Where are we going?" Grace asked as they climbed higher, the ranch house growing smaller in the valley below. "A special place," Daniel replied mysteriously. "Not much farther." The trail curved around a large boulder, and suddenly the view opened before them: a small, hidden valley nestled in the mountains, with a clear pond at its center fed by a bubbling spring. Wildflowers carpeted the ground in a riot of colors, and cottonwood trees provided dappled shade along the pond's edge. "Oh!" Grace exclaimed, drawing Daisy to a halt beside Daniel. "It's beautiful." Daniel dismounted and helped Grace down, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. "Found it my first year here. Don't think anyone else knows about it, at least. I've never seen signs of visitors." He led the horses to the pond to drink, then secured their reins to a low branch. From his saddlebag, he produced a small bundle wrapped in a cloth: bread, cheese, and dried fruit. "Thought you might be hungry," he said, spreading the cloth on a grassy spot near the water. You planned this, Grace observed, settling beside him on the makeshift picnic blanket. Guilty, he admitted with a smile. Wanted to show you there's beauty here, not just hard work and dust. They ate in companionable silence, watching the late afternoon sun cast golden light across the hidden valley. A pair of rabbits emerged from the brush to drink at the pond's edge, unafraid of the human visitors. I've been meaning to ask, Daniel said after a while. Your uncle in Flagstaff, are you certain he'll welcome you? You mentioned you've never met him. Grace had been pushing this concern to the back of her mind since leaving Chicago. He's my only hope, she said simply. Father always spoke well of him, said he had a successful mercantile business in Flagstaff. I wrote to him before leaving Chicago but had to depart before receiving a reply. And if he's not there, or not welcoming, then I'll find work, Grace said with more confidence than she felt. I'm skilled with a needle. Every town needs a seamstress. Daniel broke a piece of bread in half, his expression thoughtful. There's another option, you know. Grace's heart skipped a beat. Is there? You could stay here, he said it casually, not looking at her. Mrs. Morales isn't getting any younger. She could use the help permanently. The men appreciate having their clothes mended properly. And he finally met her gaze. I've enjoyed having you here. Grace stared at him, uncertain how to respond. Was he offering her a position as a housekeeper? Or something else? And why did the distinction matter so much to her? I don't know what to say, she managed. You don't have to decide now, Daniel said quickly. Just something to consider. After we reach Flagstaff, you can meet your uncle, see what he offers, then decide. Grace nodded, her thoughts in turmoil. The possibility of staying at the ranch hadn't occurred to her, or rather, she hadn't allowed herself to consider it. Her plan had always been clear. Reach Uncle George in Flagstaff, build a new life there. Yet in less than a week, this ranch had begun to feel like home in ways she hadn't expected. And Daniel. There was something growing between them, something neither had acknowledged directly, but which hummed in the air like electricity before a storm. As if sensing her confusion, Daniel changed the subject, telling her stories about the early days of the ranch, the first harsh winter, the spring when unexpected flooding nearly washed away the barn, the time he had to track a mountain lion that was preying on his calves. The sun was beginning to set when they finally packed up their simple picnic and remounted their horses for the ride back. The valley glowed with amber light, and the first stars were appearing in the eastern sky. Thank you for showing me this place, Grace said as they headed down the trail. It's truly special. Few things worth knowing in this life are easy to find, Daniel replied, his eyes on the path ahead. The best ones take some searching. They rode back to the ranch in a silence that was both comfortable and charged with unspoken possibilities. The ranch house was ablaze with lamplight when they arrived, and the smell of Mrs. Morales's cooking wafted out to greet them. As Daniel helped Grace dismount, his hands strong and sure at her waist, she found herself lingering in his space, looking up into his face in the gathering darkness. Grace, he said softly, her name a question and something more. Before she could respond, the ranch house door opened, spilling light across the yard. There you are, Mrs. Morales called. Dinner is ready and the men are hungry as wolves. The moment broken, Grace stepped back, smoothing her skirt with hands that trembled slightly. We should go in. Daniel nodded, his expression hidden in the shadows. I'll see to the horses. Go on ahead. That night, long after the household had retired, Grace lay awake in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of her feelings. In Chicago, she had been practical, focused on survival. Romance had seemed a luxury she couldn't afford, especially after witnessing Marion's disastrous marriage. Yet here, in this unexpected place, with this unexpected man, her carefully constructed defenses were crumbling. Daniel Lockhart was nothing like the men she had known in Chicago. There was a steadiness to him, a quiet strength that had nothing to prove. He worked with his hands, built things that lasted, treated those who depended on him with respect. And the way he looked at her sometimes, when he thought she wouldn't notice, as if she were a rare and precious thing he had discovered in this harsh land. Grace turned onto her side, pulling the colorful quilt up to her chin. In a few days, they would ride to Flagstaff. She would meet her uncle if he was there, and face whatever reception awaited her. And then she would have to decide: stay with the familiar stranger who had become her family, or build a life with the man who had caught her when she fell. The thought kept her awake long into the night, even as coyotes sang to the moon outside her window. The final days at the Double L Ranch passed too quickly for Grace's liking. As the date of their departure for Flagstaff approached, she found herself treasuring the simple routine's morning coffee with Mrs. Morales, the satisfaction of turning ragged shirts into serviceable garments once more, the quiet evenings by the fire with Daniel nearby. She had taken to riding Daisy each afternoon, exploring the ranch under the pretext of delivering lunch to the men working in distant pastures. In truth, she had discovered a love for the freedom of horseback riding, the connection with an animal that responded to her gentlest commands, the wind in her face as they cantered across open ground. "You're becoming a fine horsewoman," Daniel observed on the afternoon before their planned departure. He had found her brushing Daisy in the barn after a ride. "Hard to believe you'd never been on a horse a week ago." Grace smiled, running the brush along Daisy's sleek neck. "I had a good teacher. And Daisy is very patient with me." Daniel leaned against the stall door, watching her work. "She likes you. Horses know good people when they meet them." "Is that so?" Grace glanced at him, a teasing light in her eyes. "And what about cowboys? Do they have the same discernment?" "Some better than others." His voice was warm, intimate in the shadowed barn. "The smart ones know when they've found something worth holding onto." The air between them seemed to thicken. Grace's hand stilled on Daisy's neck as she met Daniel's steady gaze. "And have you?" she asked softly. "Found something worth holding onto?" Daniel straightened, taking a step into the stall. "I believe I have. Question is, does she want to be held?" Grace's heart thundered in her chest. This was the moment toward which they had been moving since he caught her, as she fell from the train, the acknowledgement of what had been growing between them, invisible but as real as the ground beneath their feet. "Daniel!" A shout from outside interrupted her. "Boss! Rider coming in fast!" Daniel's expression shifted, the tender moment broken by the urgency in his foreman's voice. "Stay here," he told Grace, already turning toward the barn door. "What is it?" she asked, alarmed by the sudden tension in his shoulders. "Probably nothing," he said, though his tone belied the words. But unexpected visitors in a hurry rarely bring good news. Grace followed him despite his instruction, emerging from the barn in time to see a rider galloping into the yard, his horse lathered with sweat from hard riding. Sam and the other hands were converging on the scene from different directions, their hands hovering near their sidearms. The rider reined his exhausted mount to a stop, raising a hand in greeting when he spotted Daniel. "Lockhart, thank God you're home." "Ellis, what brings you out this way?" Daniel strode toward the man, who Grace now saw was middle-aged, with a sheriff's badge pinned to his vest. "Trouble," the sheriff said grimly, dismounting. "The Blackwood gang hit Oatman yesterday, robbed the bank, shot 2 people. Word is they're headed north." A chill ran down Grace's spine. She had heard of the Blackwood gang, even in Chicago, notorious outlaws who had terrorized the Arizona Territory for years. "Anyone killed?" Daniel asked, his voice hard. "No, thank God. Old man Phillips took a bullet in the arm and one of the tellers caught a graze. But they got away with over $5,000. Sheriff Ellis accepted a canteen from Sam, taking a long drink. "I'm riding to warn the ranches in the area. They've been known to hit isolated homesteads when they're on the run." Daniel's jaw tightened. "How many in the gang?" "5 that we know of. Lucas Blackwood, his brother James, that Mexican killer they ride with Ramirez, and 2 others I don't know by name." "Appreciate the warning, Ellis," Daniel said. "We'll keep a sharp lookout." The sheriff nodded, glancing around the yard, his gaze landing on Grace. A question formed in his eyes, but Daniel spoke before he could ask it. "Miss O'Connor is a guest," he said simply. "I'm escorting her to Flagstaff tomorrow to meet her uncle." "Might want to delay that journey," Ellis advised. "Safer to stay put until we round up Blackwood and his boys." "I've got posses forming in 3 counties." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "We'll consider it. You need anything before you ride on? Fresh horse? Food?" "No time. Got to reach the Wilson place before dark. Just keep your men armed and your eyes open." Ellis swung back into his saddle with a grimace. "These boys are desperate and mean. Don't take any chances if you spot them." With that warning, he spurred his horse and galloped out of the yard, heading north toward the neighboring ranch. Daniel turned to Sam. "Get the men together. Double the night watch, and no one rides alone until further notice." "Yes, boss," Sam said, already moving to carry out the orders. Daniel's eyes found Grace, who stood frozen by the barn door. "Let's get inside," he said, crossing to her and placing a protective hand at the small of her back. "We need to talk." In the house, Mrs. Morales was waiting, her expression worried. "I heard the Blackwood gang." "Yes," Daniel confirmed grimly. "Sheriff Ellis just rode through with a warning." "Dios nos procha," the housekeeper murmured, crossing herself. "Those men are devils." Daniel guided Grace to a chair at the table. "Sheriff's right about one thing. We should delay our trip to Flagstaff until this blows over." "How long might that be?" Grace asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "Hard to say. Depends on whether they're caught quickly or manage to lose the posses in the mountains." Daniel ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Grace had come to recognize as a sign of his concern. "Could be days. Could be longer, Mrs. Morales set about making coffee, her movements brisk and efficient despite her obvious anxiety. "The Blackwood gang robbed the stage to Prescott last year," she told Grace. "Killed the driver and a passenger. Very bad men." "The ranch is remote," Daniel said reassuringly, "and we'll be vigilant. The men are experienced and they'll be on guard." Grace nodded, trying to absorb this sudden shift in their plans. Part of her was selfishly pleased at the prospect of more time at the ranch, more days with Daniel. But the reason for the delay cast a shadow over that pleasure. "Your uncle will have to wait a bit longer," Daniel said, as if reading her thoughts. "I'm sorry for the delay." "It can't be helped," Grace replied. "Safety must come first." Daniel's expression softened. "We were interrupted earlier. In the barn." Despite the seriousness of the situation, Grace felt heat rise to her cheeks at the memory of their almost confession. "Yes, we were." Mrs. Morales, sensing the undercurrents, busied herself at the stove, deliberately making more noise than necessary with the pots and pans. "When this is over," Daniel said quietly, "when we're sure it's safe, we'll finish that conversation." Grace nodded, her eyes meeting his. "I'd like that." The mood at dinner that evening was subdued. The men ate quickly, their usual banter replaced by serious discussions of watch rotations and defensive measures. Grace observed the transformation with interest. These men, who had seemed so relaxed and good-natured, now revealed the harder edges that life on the frontier had honed. After the meal, Daniel joined Sam and the others in checking the property, ensuring all buildings were secure and weapons were ready if needed. Grace helped Mrs. Morales with the washing up, the two women working in companionable silence until the older woman spoke. "He cares for you very much," she said, her hands busy with a pot. "I have not seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you." Grace focused on drying a plate, uncertain how to respond. "I care for him too," she admitted finally, "more than I expected to." Mrs. Morales nodded wisely. "Love is like that, comes when we are not looking for it." "I didn't say anything about love," Grace protested weakly. The housekeeper's knowing smile spoke volumes. "You did not need to, Nina. These old eyes can still see what is in front of them." Before Grace could formulate a response, the back door opened and Daniel entered, bringing with him the cool night air. "All quiet," he reported. "Sam and Pete are taking the first watch. We'll rotate through the night. Will you sleep at all?" Grace asked, concerned by the lines of fatigue already visible around his eyes. "I'll take the dawn watch," he said. "Get a few hours rest first." Mrs. Morales pushed him toward the table. "Sit. You need more coffee if you are to be up half the night." Daniel complied, removing his hat and placing it on the table beside him. "Thank you, Alina." The use of the housekeeper's first name, something Grace had rarely heard, spoke of the depth of their relationship, the years they had weathered together on this remote ranch. Mrs. Morales poured him a cup of coffee, then discreetly withdrew to her room off the kitchen, leaving Daniel and Grace alone. "You should rest too," Daniel told Grace, his voice gentle. "No sense in everyone losing sleep." "I'm not sure I could, knowing those men might be nearby," she admitted, taking the chair across from him. Daniel reached across the table to cover her hand with his own. "The ranch is well protected. The men know what they're doing." "Have you encountered the Blackwood gang before?" she asked. A shadow crossed his face. "Once, 3 years ago. They tried to steal cattle from the south pasture. We drove them off, but not before they shot one of my men." His jaw tightened. "Ben died 2 days later. He was 22 years old." "I'm sorry," Grace said softly, turning her hand to clasp his. They sat in silence for a time, hands linked on the table between them, the oil lamp casting warm light over their faces. Outside, the night was still, the usual chorus of coyotes eerily absent, as if even the wild creatures sensed the tension in the air. "You should go up to bed," Daniel said eventually. "I need to check on the men before I get some rest myself." Grace nodded, reluctantly withdrawing her hand. "Please be careful." "Always am," he assured her with a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. She rose and moved toward the stairs, pausing at the bottom to look back at him. He sat where she had left him, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the lamplight, the weight of responsibility evident in his posture. "Daniel," she said softly. He turned to face her. "Thank you for everything." His expression warmed. "Get some sleep, Grace. Tomorrow's another day." Despite Daniel's reassurances, Grace slept fitfully, waking at every sound: the creak of the house settling, the distant call of a night bird, the soft footsteps of men changing watch outside. When she finally gave up on sleep just before dawn, she dressed quickly and went downstairs, intending to help Mrs. Morales with breakfast. To her surprise, the kitchen was empty, though the stove was lit and coffee was brewing. A note on the table in Mrs. Morales's careful handwriting explained that she had gone to gather eggs from the henhouse. Grace poured herself a cup of coffee and moved to the window, looking out at the ranch yard bathed in the gray light of approaching dawn. She could see Daniel and Sam standing near the corral, deep in conversation, their breath visible in the cool morning air. They both looked tired but alert, scanning the surroundings as they talked. A movement at the edge of the yard caught her eye, a flash of color that didn't belong. Grace leaned closer to the window, straining to see. Her blood froze. A man she didn't recognize was creeping along the edge of the barn, a rifle in his hands. Behind him, two more figures emerged from the shadows, moving with the stealth of predators. Without thinking, Grace threw open the door and shouted, "Daniel! Behind you!" Her warning came just in time. Daniel and Sam spun around as the first shots rang out, diving for cover behind the water trough. The peaceful morning erupted into chaos as bullets splintered wood and kicked up dust around the yard. Grace ducked back inside as a bullet shattered the window beside her, showering her with glass. Heart pounding, she pressed herself against the wall, trying to process what was happening. The Blackwood gang had found them. Outside, she could hear the exchange of gunfire, men shouting, the panicked whinnying of horses in the corral. She had to help somehow, had to do something. The back door burst open and Mrs. Morales rushed in, her face pale with fear. "Grace, are you hurt?" "No, I'm fine. The gang, they're here. I saw them from the hen house," the housekeeper confirmed grimly. "3 by the barn, 2 more circling around back." She moved purposefully to a cabinet, unlocking it to reveal a shotgun. Been expecting this day since Sheriff Ellis brought his warning. Grace stared at the older woman, who suddenly looked far more formidable than her usual grandmotherly self. "You know how to use that?" Mrs. Morales checked the weapon with practiced hands. 15 years on this frontier, Nina. A woman learns what she must. She handed Grace a revolver from the same cabinet. Grace took the gun hesitantly. "My father taught me basics for protection in Chicago. Good. Today you may need it." Mrs. Morales moved to the window, carefully peering out. The men are pinned down. Daniel and Sam behind the trough, Pete and Tom in the bunkhouse. Cannot see Jake. More shots rang out, followed by a cry of pain that made Grace's heart constrict. Whose voice was that? Not Daniel's, surely. "We must help them," she said, gripping the revolver tightly. "They're outnumbered." Mrs. Morales nodded grimly. "The gang does not know we are armed. That is our advantage." She pointed to the back door. "There is a cellar entrance behind the house, hidden by bushes. It leads to the root cellar, then up into the pantry. If we can reach it, we can come up behind any men at the rear of the house." Grace took a deep breath, steadying her nerves. "Show me." Together, they crept out the back door, staying low and using the garden plot for cover. Grace's heart hammered against her ribs, every sense heightened by fear and adrenaline. The gunfire continued at the front of the house, drawing the attention of their attackers away from the two women. They reached the cellar doors without incident, Mrs. Morales lifting them just enough for them to slip inside. The root cellar was cool and dark, smelling of earth and stored vegetables. A narrow staircase led up to a trapdoor in the ceiling. "This opens into the pantry," Mrs. Morales whispered, leading the way. "From there, we can see if anyone has entered the house." They climbed the stairs carefully, Mrs. Morales lifting the trapdoor a fraction to peer into the pantry. "Clear," she murmured, pushing it fully open and climbing through. Grace followed, emerging into the familiar pantry just off the kitchen. The sounds of gunfire were louder here, punctuated by men's shouts and the crash of breaking glass. A new sound made them both freeze boot steps on the front porch, followed by the creak of the front door opening. "Check the house," a harsh voice commanded. "Find anyone inside and bring them out. Lockhart's got to surrender if we have hostages." Mrs. Morales's eyes met Grace's, a silent communication passing between them. They positioned themselves on either side of the pantry door, weapons ready. Grace's palms were slick with sweat around the revolver, but her grip remained firm. The footsteps entered the main room, moving toward the kitchen. A man's voice muttered something unintelligible, followed by the sound of drawers being yanked open and contents dumped onto the floor. Mrs. Morales held up 3 fingers, then 2, then 1. As a figure appeared in the pantry doorway, the housekeeper swung the butt of her shotgun in a vicious arc, connecting with the man's temple. He crumpled without a sound, his pistol clattering to the floor. Ramirez, Mrs. Morales spat, looking down at the unconscious outlaw. The one who killed Ben. Grace stared at the fallen man, then at Mrs. Morales with newfound respect. What now? We secure him, then help the others. The housekeeper searched the man, removing a second pistol and a wicked-looking knife from his belt. There is rope in that drawer. Tie his hands and feet tightly. Grace did as instructed, binding the outlaw securely while Mrs. Morales kept watch at the kitchen window. Outside, the gunfight continued. I see only 2 men by the barn now, Mrs. Morales reported. One must be in front of the house and this one here. She nudged the unconscious Ramirez with her foot. That's 4, Grace said, completing the knots on the outlaw's bonds. Sheriff Ellis said there were 5. A floorboard creaked behind them. That would be me, a cold voice said. They turned to find a tall, lean man standing in the doorway that led to the main room, a revolver pointed at them. His clothes were dusty from the trail, his face half hidden by several days' growth of beard, but his eyes were coldly intelligent. Lucas Blackwood, Mrs. Morales said, her voice steady despite the gun aimed at her chest. The same. He gestured with his weapon. Shotgun on the floor, ladies. Slowly, Mrs. Morales complied, her expression defiant. You will not leave this ranch alive, Blackwood. Bold words from a woman about to die, he remarked, his tone conversational. But I have no quarrel with you. It's Lockhart I want. He cost me a good man 3 years ago. Your man was stealing cattle, Mrs. Morales retorted. He got what thieves deserve. Blackwood's eyes hardened. Careful, old woman. My patience has limits. His gaze shifted to Grace, taking in her appearance with an appraising look that made her skin crawl. And who might you be? Lockhart's woman. Before Grace could respond, gunfire erupted directly outside the house, closer than before. Blackwood glanced toward the window, momentarily distracted. It was all the opening Grace needed. She raised the revolver which had been partially hidden by her skirt and fired. The sound was deafening in the confined space of the kitchen. Blackwood staggered backward, shock registering on his face as he clutched his shoulder. His gun discharged as he fell, the bullet splintering the doorframe above Grace's head. Mrs. Morales moved with surprising speed for her age, retrieving her shotgun and training it on the wounded outlaw. Do not move, she warned him. The next shot will not be so merciful. Blackwood glared at them, his face contorted with pain and rage. You'll regret this, he ground out. I regret only that she did not aim for your black heart, Mrs. Morales replied coldly. The front door burst open, and Daniel appeared, his rifle at the ready, his face streaked with dirt and what looked like blood. He took in the scene in an instant. Ramirez unconscious on the floor, Blackwood wounded and under Mrs. Morales's watchful eye, Grace still holding the smoking revolver. Are you hurt? He demanded, his eyes finding Grace's. No, she assured him, her voice surprisingly steady. We're both fine. Are you? There's blood. Not mine, he said grimly. One of Blackwood's men got too close to the trough. He won't be troubling anyone again. His gaze shifted to Blackwood. Lucas, been a while. Not long enough, Lockhart, the outlaw spat. Sam appeared in the doorway behind Daniel, his right arm bound with a makeshift bandage. Boss, Jake got James Blackwood. Other 2 are making a run for it on foot. Tom and Pete are in pursuit. Daniel nodded. Secure these 2. Sheriff Ellis should be on his way. One of the hands from the Wilson place spotted the gang heading this way and rode to alert him. Sam moved to bind Blackwood, who winced as the foreman roughly pulled his injured arm behind his back. Daniel crossed to Grace, taking the revolver gently from her hands. "You're shaking," he observed, his voice soft with concern. Grace hadn't noticed until he mentioned it, but indeed a delayed reaction was setting in, her limbs trembling with the aftermath of fear and adrenaline. I shot him," she said, the reality of it suddenly hitting her. "You did what you had to do," Daniel assured her, guiding her to a chair. "You were very brave. Both of you," he added, nodding to Mrs. Morales. "The girl has a steady hand and a cool head," the housekeeper said approvingly. Blackwood never saw it coming. Sam hauled the now secured outlaw to his feet. "Where do you want them, boss?" "Root cellar for now," Daniel decided. "It's secure, and we can tend to Blackwood's wound there." His voice hardened. "Enough to keep him alive for the gallows." As Sam dragged the outlaws away, Mrs. Morales busied herself making fresh coffee and assessing the damage to her kitchen. Daniel remained by Grace's side, one hand resting protectively on her shoulder. "I'm sorry you were put in danger," he said quietly. "This isn't what I intended when I invited you to stay at the ranch." Grace looked up at him, finding his blue eyes clouded with guilt. "You couldn't have known this would happen," she said. "And I'm not sorry I was here. If Mrs. Morales had been alone—" "She's tougher than she looks," Daniel said with a small smile. "But yes, I'm grateful you were together." His expression grew serious again. "Taking a life or even attempting to it changes a person. I know that burden well." "I didn't think," Grace admitted. "I just saw him threatening us, threatening you by extension, and I acted." Daniel's hand moved to cup her cheek, his touch gentle despite the calluses on his palm. "That's courage, Grace. Acting when it matters most despite the fear." Their eyes held, something profound passing between them, an understanding that went beyond words, forged in the crucible of danger and shared purpose. The moment was broken by a commotion outside, horses approaching at a gallop, men's voices calling out. Daniel straightened, his hand falling away from Grace's face. "That'll be Sheriff Ellis and his posse," he said, moving toward the door. "Duty calls." Grace watched him go, her heart still racing but no longer from fear alone. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Sheriff Ellis arrived with a dozen deputies, securing the captured outlaws and organizing a search for the two who had escaped. The wounded were tended to. Sam's arm had been grazed by a bullet, and one of the other hands had taken a more serious wound to his leg. But thankfully, none of the ranch's defenders had been killed. Lucas Blackwood and Ramirez were bound to their saddles and led away under heavy guard, Blackwood glowering at Daniel and Grace as he passed. The body of James Blackwood was wrapped in canvas and slung over a pack horse, a grim reminder of the violence that had touched the peaceful ranch. By mid-afternoon, a semblance of normalcy had returned to the Double L. The men set about repairing the damage to the building's broken windows, bullet holes in walls, a section of the corral fence that had been splintered in the gunfight. Mrs. Morales prepared a hearty meal for everyone, insisting that hard work and fear both built appetites that needed satisfying. Grace helped where she could, washing bandages, serving food and coffee, mending torn clothing that resulted from the morning's chaos. Throughout it all, she was acutely aware of Daniel moving about the ranch, directing repairs, checking on his injured men, conferring with Sheriff Ellis about the likelihood of capturing the remaining outlaws. It was nearly sunset when Sheriff Ellis and his posse finally departed, promising to return if the escaped gang members were spotted nearby. Daniel saw them off, then joined Grace on the porch, where she had retreated to watch the sunset and find a moment's peace. "How are you holding up?" he asked, settling beside her on the bench. "Better than I expected," she admitted. though I suspect the true reaction may come later when everything is quiet again. Daniel nodded, understanding. That's common. After my first real fight with rustlers, I was steady as a rock until 3 days later. Then my hands shook so badly I couldn't saddle my horse. Grace smiled faintly. That's oddly reassuring. They sat in companionable silence for a time, watching as the sun painted the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. The events of the morning seemed almost dreamlike now, hard to reconcile with the peaceful scene before them. "Sheriff Ellis thinks it's safe for us to travel now," Daniel said eventually. The remaining Blackwood gang members were seen heading west away from here, and with Lucas and Ramirez in custody, there's little danger of the others returning. "So we can go to Flagstaff?" Grace asked, surprised by the reluctance she felt at the prospect. "Tomorrow, if you wish." Daniel turned to face her, his expression serious. "But before we make that journey, I think we have a conversation to finish." Grace's heart quickened. "Yes, I believe we do." Daniel took her hands in his touch warm and sure. "Grace O'Connor, I know we've known each other only a short time. By any reasonable standard, it's too soon for what I'm about to say." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "But today reminded me that life on the frontier is uncertain. Time isn't guaranteed." "Daniel," she began, but he gently pressed a finger to her lips. "Please let me finish while I have the courage." He took a deep breath. "When you fell from that train and into my arms, something changed for me. I've built this ranch, made a good life here, but I've been incomplete, lonely, though I barely recognized it until you arrived." Grace felt tears gathering in her eyes, but she remained silent, allowing him to continue. "This past week, watching you adapt to ranch life, seeing your strength and determination, your kindness to Mrs. Morales, your skill with needle and thread. And then today, your courage in the face of danger." He squeezed her hands. "I find myself hoping you might consider staying, not as my housekeeper but as my wife." The tears spilled over now, tracing warm paths down Grace's cheeks. "Daniel, you don't have to answer now," he said quickly. "We'll still go to Flagstaff. You should meet your uncle, explore your options. I don't want you to choose me out of necessity or gratitude." "Daniel Lockhart," Grace said firmly, freeing one hand to touch his face. "Be quiet and listen to me." Surprised, he fell silent. "I was going to say yes." Her smile was radiant despite her tears. "Yes, I'll stay. Yes, I'll be your wife. Not out of necessity or gratitude, but because in the space of a week, you've shown me more kindness, more respect, and more genuine affection than I've known since my parents died." Daniel's face transformed with joy, years seeming to fall away as he pulled her into his arms. "You're sure?" "Your uncle, I'll still want to meet him, of course. He's my only blood relation. But home isn't always where your blood is." She rested her head against his chest, hearing the strong, steady beat of his heart. "Sometimes it's where you fall or where someone catches you when you do." Daniel tilted her face up to his expression tender. "May I kiss you, Grace O'Connor, future Mrs. Lockhart?" In answer, she rose on tiptoe and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, then deepened as Daniel's arms tightened around her. Grace had been kissed before, by earnest young men in Chicago who had courted her briefly. But never like this, never with the sense that she was exactly where she was meant to be, with exactly the right person. When they finally broke apart, both a little breathless, the sun had disappeared below the horizon, leaving the sky a deepening blue. The first stars were appearing, bright pinpricks of light in the vast expanse above. "Well," Daniel said, his voice husky, "that's a fine way to seal an engagement." Grace laughed, feeling lighter than she had in months, perhaps years. "Indeed it is." The sound of the front door opening behind them made them step slightly apart, though Daniel kept one arm around Grace's waist. Mrs. Morales stood in the doorway, a knowing smile on her face. "Dinner is ready," she announced. "But perhaps you have already found something sweeter." "No," Daniel grinned, not bothering to deny it. "Mrs. Morales, I'm pleased to inform you that Miss O'Connor has agreed to become Mrs. Lockhart." The housekeeper clapped her hands together in delight. "Gracias a Dios. Finally, this house will have a proper mistress." She rushed forward to embrace Grace. "I knew from the moment he brought you here, this one. She is special." Grace returned the embrace, touched by the older woman's genuine happiness. "Thank you for welcoming me, for teaching me about ranch life. I have much more to learn." "Ah, but you have a lifetime to learn it now," Mrs. Morales said, beaming. "Come, come, we must celebrate." She hustled them inside, where the evening meal became an impromptu engagement celebration. Sam and the other hands offered their congratulations, albeit with some teasing directed at Daniel about how quickly he had fallen. Tom produced a fiddle from the bunkhouse and played lively tunes while Mrs. Morales insisted everyone have an extra helping of dessert, her special flan, made with precious vanilla she had been saving for an important occasion. Late that night, after the celebrations had wound down and the house was quiet once more, Grace stood at her bedroom window, gazing out at the moonlit landscape of what would soon be her home. So much had changed in such a short time. Just over a week ago, she had been desperate and alone, willing to risk her life to reach a relative she had never met, in a town she had never seen. Now she had found something she had stopped believing in. A place to belong, people who cared for her, a future filled with purpose and love. A soft knock at her door roused her from her thoughts. Opening it, she found Daniel standing there, a small box in his hands. "I couldn't sleep," he admitted. "Too many thoughts." He held out the box. "This was my mother's. I've carried it with me since leaving Texas, thinking someday I might have need of it. Now I do." Grace took the box and opened it, gasping softly at the contents, a simple gold band set with a small but perfect diamond. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Not as beautiful as the woman who will wear it," Daniel replied, taking the ring from the box and sliding it onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if made for her. "Now it's official." Grace admired the ring in the moonlight streaming through her window. "I never expected this when I boarded that train in Chicago. And I never expected to catch a woman falling from the sky," Daniel said with a smile. "Life has a way of surprising us when we least expect it." He kissed her once more, softly and sweetly, then bid her good night. As Grace closed her door and returned to the window, she thought about the extraordinary chain of events that had led her here. Being thrown from that train had seemed like disaster at the time, the lowest moment of a journey already fraught with hardship and uncertainty. Yet without that moment of desperation and danger, she might never have found her way to the Double L Ranch, to Daniel Lockhart, to this new life that stretched before her like the vast Arizona landscape, challenging, beautiful, and filled with promise. Tomorrow they would ride to Flagstaff, where Grace would meet her uncle and share the news of her engagement. Then they would return to the ranch, to home, where they would build a life together, facing whatever challenges the frontier might bring, side by side. For now, though, she was content to stand at her window, watching the stars wheel overhead and feeling, for the first time in a very long while, that she was exactly where she was meant to be. True to his word, Daniel took Grace to Flagstaff the following week. The journey was long but pleasant, with Grace now comfortable enough on horseback to ride Daisy the entire way rather than sharing Rusty with Daniel. They followed mountain trails and crossed open valleys, camping under the stars each night, their conversations flowing easily as they planned their future together. Flagstaff itself, was larger than Grace had expected, a bustling town that had grown rapidly since the arrival of the railroad in 1882. Buildings lined streets arranged in a grid pattern, with the impressive San Francisco peaks providing a dramatic backdrop to the north. They found George O'Connor's Mercantile without difficulty, a substantial two-story building on the main street with O'Connor's General Merchandise painted in bold letters across the front. Grace felt a flutter of nervousness as they tied their horses outside. This man was her last living blood relative, yet he was a complete stranger to her. Daniel sensed her anxiety and took her hand. "He's family," he reminded her gently. "Your father's brother." "What if he doesn't want to meet me?" Grace worried. "What if he never received my letter?" "Then he'll be surprised," Daniel said practically. "But you won't know until you go inside." Taking a deep breath, Grace entered the store, Daniel at her side. The interior was well stocked and orderly, with shelves reaching to the ceiling filled with everything from canned goods to tools to bolts of fabric. A gray-haired man was assisting a customer at the counter, his back to them as they entered. When the bell above the door announced their arrival, he called over his shoulder, "With you in a moment. Feel free to browse." There was something familiar about his voice that made Grace's breath catch. When he finally turned to them, she saw her father's eyes looking out from a face both familiar and strange, the same strong nose and square jaw, but weathered by years of western sun and wind. "Good day," he began, then stopped, his eyes widening as he took in Grace's appearance. "My God," he said softly, "you look just like your mother." "Uncle George," Grace's voice trembled slightly. "Grace." He moved from behind the counter, approaching slowly as if afraid she might disappear. "Little Grace O'Connor, not so little anymore," she said with a tentative smile. "Good heavens!" He stared at her in wonder. "I received your letter only last week. I was preparing to send funds for your journey west, but you're already here." He hesitated, then opened his arms. "May I?" Grace stepped into his embrace, tears welling in her eyes as she was enveloped in the warm hug of family. There was something of her father in his embrace, a connection to the past she had feared lost forever. When they separated, George wiped his own eyes unashamedly. "Your father wrote often, but his letters stopped coming. I feared the worst but had no way to confirm it." His expression grew somber. "I'm so sorry about your parents, child. It must have been terribly difficult for you." "It was," Grace acknowledged, "but I've been fortunate in other ways." She turned to Daniel, who had been waiting quietly nearby. "Uncle George, this is Daniel Lockhart, my fiancé." George's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Fiancé? Well, you certainly have a lot to tell me." He extended a hand to Daniel. "George O'Connor. Pleased to meet the man who has won my niece's heart." "The pleasure is mine, sir," Daniel replied, shaking the older man's hand firmly. "Grace has spoken highly of you." George looked bemused. "Though we've never met until today." He glanced around the store, which was beginning to fill with afternoon customers. "This isn't the place for a proper reunion. My home is above the store. Why don't we go up and you can tell me everything over tea? Martha," he called to a middle-aged woman arranging a display of canned goods. "Mind the store for a while, would you? My niece has arrived from Chicago." Upstairs, George's living quarters were comfortable and well-appointed, reflecting the success of his business. Over tea and sandwiches prepared by his housekeeper, Grace recounted her journey west, her parents' deaths, her desperate attempt to reach Flagstaff, being thrown from the train, and Daniel's timely rescue. George listened with rapt attention, his expression shifting from sympathy to alarm to amazement as the story unfolded. When Grace described the attack by the Blackwood gang and her role in capturing Lucas Blackwood, he shook his head in disbelief. "My brother's daughter," he said, wonder in his voice. "William always said you had spirit, but this—" He chuckled. "You're certainly an O'Connor." "She's remarkable," Daniel agreed, his eyes warm as they rested on Grace. "I knew it from the moment she fell into my arms." George studied the couple thoughtfully. "So you've known each other just over 2 weeks and already you're engaged." "I know it seems sudden," Grace began, but George waved away her concern. "Out here, we learn to recognize what matters quickly," he said. "Life's too uncertain to waste time when you find something worth holding on to." He smiled at Daniel. "I can see you care deeply for my niece, and Grace has always had good judgment. Her letters showed that even as a child." "You received my childhood letters?" Grace asked, surprised. "Every one," George confirmed. "Kept them all. I never had children of my own, you see. My wife Sarah passed before we were so blessed." A shadow of old grief crossed his face. "Your letters and your father's were my connection to family." "I wish I had known," Grace said softly. "Father always spoke warmly of you, but I had no idea you treasured our correspondence so much. Well, now you're here in person, which is far better than letters." George raised his teacup in a small salute. "To family reunited and expanded." He nodded at Daniel. "When is the happy day to be?" "We thought perhaps next month," Daniel replied. "Time enough to prepare, but not so long that we risk another winter wedding. The pass between here and the ranch can be treacherous once snow falls." "A wise precaution," George agreed. "And where will you live after the wedding?" "At the ranch," Grace said. "It's Daniel's home, built with his own hands, and it's becoming mine too." "You always were adaptable," George observed. "Your father worried you were too sheltered in the city. He'd be pleased to know you found your place in the West." The conversation continued as the afternoon stretched into evening. George insisted they stay for dinner, eager to learn more about the Double L Ranch and Daniel's background. For his part, Daniel found himself enjoying the older man's company, appreciating his sharp mind and genuine concern for Grace's welfare. After dinner, George revealed a surprise. "I have something for you, Grace. Wait here." He disappeared into another room and returned carrying a large wooden box, which he placed on the table before her. "Your grandmother's wedding trousseau," he explained. "Sarah kept it all these years, hoping someday to pass it on to a daughter. When she passed, I couldn't bear to part with it. Now I know why." Grace opened the box with reverent hands, finding inside a wedding dress of ivory silk, yellowed slightly with age but still beautiful, along with a lace veil, kid gloves, and various accessories. "It's beautiful," she whispered, tears pricking her eyes. "But are you sure?" "These are precious heirlooms." "Who else would I give them to?" George asked simply. "You're my only family, Grace, and I'd like to think Sarah would be pleased to know her wedding things would serve her niece by marriage." "Thank you," Grace said, deeply moved. "I'll treasure them." That night, George insisted they stay in his guest rooms rather than at the hotel. As Grace prepared for bed, there was a soft knock at her door. Opening it, she found Daniel standing there, his expression thoughtful. "Everything all right?" she asked, stepping back to allow him entry. "Just thinking," he said, moving to the window that overlooked the main street of Flagstaff, now quiet in the late hour. "Your uncle is a good man. I'm glad you found him." "So am I," Grace agreed, joining him at the window. "It feels strange having family again after being alone for so long." Daniel turned to her, taking her hands in his. "You're not alone anymore, Grace. You have George. You have Mrs. Morales and the hands at the Double L, and you have me." He kissed her gently. "Always." The following day, after a heartfelt farewell and promises to return for regular visits, Grace and Daniel departed Flagstaff for the journey back to the ranch. George insisted on providing Grace with a proper side saddle for Daisy, more suitable for a lady. he declared, along with several new dresses, practical riding clothes, and other necessities that would make ranch life more comfortable. As they rode away from Flagstaff, Grace felt a curious mixture of emotion, sadness at leaving her newly discovered uncle, anticipation for the life that awaited her at the Double L, and above all, a deep contentment that she had found her place in this vast, challenging land. "Penny for your thoughts," Daniel said as they paused to rest the horses beside a clear stream. Grace smiled at him, the sun warm on her face. "I was just thinking how strange life is. If I hadn't been thrown from that train, if you hadn't been riding by at that exact moment." "I don't believe in coincidence," Daniel said, reaching across to take her hand. "Some things are meant to be. You were meant to fall, and I was meant to catch you." "A rather romantic view for a practical rancher," Grace teased. "You bring out unexpected sides of me, future Mrs. Lockhart," he replied with a grin. "Get used to it." The wedding took place on a glorious October day with the mountains cloaked in the gold and crimson of autumn. Mrs. Morales transformed the ranch house with wildflowers and ribbons, and a local minister rode out from Oatman to perform the ceremony. George O'Connor made the journey from Flagstaff, bringing with him wedding gifts and supplies for the celebration feast. Sheriff Ellis and his wife attended, along with ranchers from neighboring properties and the entire staff of the Double L. Grace wore her grandmother's wedding dress, which Mrs. Morales had skillfully altered to fit her perfectly. Daniel, usually seen in work clothes or riding gear, surprised everyone by appearing in a new suit ordered specially from Flagstaff. Under a canopy of aspens near the creek where Daniel had taken Grace on their picnic, they exchanged vows, promising to love and cherish each other through all the challenges and joys that frontier life might bring. When Daniel kissed his bride, the assembled guests erupted in cheers, and Sam Mitchell fired his six-shooter into the air in traditional Western celebration. The wedding feast lasted well into the evening, with music, dancing, and more food than the Double L had ever seen at one time. Mrs. Morales presided over the kitchen like a general, directing the women who had come to help with quiet authority, while Sam ensured that the celebratory whiskey was enjoyed responsibly by the ranch hands. As twilight deepened into night, the newlyweds slipped away from the festivities to the ranch house, which would now truly be their home together. Daniel had added a new room during the weeks before the wedding, expanding the master bedroom to accommodate a larger bed and Grace's growing collection of belongings. "Welcome home, Mrs. Lockhart," he said, carrying her across the threshold in traditional fashion. "I think I've been home since the day I fell into your arms," Grace replied, kissing him soundly. The years that followed brought both challenges and joys to the Lockharts. The Double L Ranch prospered under their joint stewardship, with Grace proving to have a head for business that complemented Daniel's practical ranching skills. They expanded their holdings, added new structures to the ranch, and continued to improve their herd with careful breeding. George O'Connor became a frequent visitor, delighting in his role as Grace's rediscovered family. Mrs. Morales continued to run the household with her usual efficiency, though she gradually ceded more responsibilities to Grace as the younger woman grew confident in her role as mistress of the ranch. Their first child, a son they named William George after Grace's father and uncle, arrived in the summer of 1887, followed 2 years later by a daughter, Sarah Elena, honoring both Daniel's mother and Mrs. Morales. A third child, Thomas Samuel, completed their family in 1892, named for Daniel's brother and his loyal foreman. Each spring, as wildflowers bloomed across the ranch and new calves wobbled beside their mothers in the green pastures, Daniel and Grace would ride together to the hidden valley where he had first proposed. There, amid the beauty that had first helped Grace see the possibilities of her new life, they would share a simple picnic and reflect on how far they had come since that fateful day when a desperate young woman was thrown from a train and into the arms of a cowboy who would change her life forever. And often, as they watched their children grow strong and free in the Arizona landscape, they would remind them of the family story, how sometimes the worst moments can lead to the greatest joys, how falling can lead to being caught, and how love can bloom in the most unexpected circumstances. Life has a way of throwing us from the train when we least expect it, Grace would tell her wide-eyed children as Daniel's arm tightened around her shoulders. The secret is finding someone to catch you when you fall.